The first crack of the gavel is thunder, rattling glass pitchers until water trembles across the polished wood. The judge leans forward, his voice iron, demanding silence. A juror's knuckles whiten as she grips the armrest, her chest rising too fast. The witness shakes on the stand, a young man no older than 30, sweat shining on his temple, blurting words he cannot take back. "I saw him do it," he says, voice breaking, and the room stops breathing. The defense attorney rises like a blade unsheathed, sharp eyes darting to the jury as though seizing the moment. In the gallery, a reporter freezes mid-word, ink blotting her notes, while a coffee cup tips from a clerk's hand and shatters, liquid bleeding across marble. The air becomes heavy, drenched in dread, as though the walls themselves carry judgment. The protagonist sits at the table, unseen in their stillness, heart pounding like a drum against ribs. They feel cornered already, destroyed before their defense can even begin. The silence after the outburst feels longer than time itself, pressing down on every chest. The defense attorney smirks, leaning back, his confidence radiating as if he already owns the verdict. Across the room, the prosecutor seizes the moment, stepping forward with a dramatic pause, voice carrying the weight of certainty. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the truth," he declares. Gasps ripple again, and the protagonist stares down at the table, shoulders slumped, heart pounding. A juror scratches nervously at her notepad. The witness avoids eye contact, trembling hands clenched tight. The room feels suffocating, like judgment already passed. The protagonist whispers inwardly, praying that someone, anyone, still believes them. The judge clears his throat, his gravelly voice cutting through the static tension. He warns the gallery to remain silent, his gavel hovering like a threat. The witness stares at the floor, eyes glassy, as if his confession wounded himself as much as it condemned another. The protagonist lifts his gaze, meeting the jurors' uncertain stares. One juror avoids his eyes entirely. Another looks shaken. A third scribbles something hurriedly. The defense attorney studies them like prey, calculating each flicker of doubt. The protagonist feels their identity crumbling, not as a man but as a symbol of betrayal. Once loved by millions, now abandoned in a sea of judgment. The gallery murmurs despite the warning, whispers slithering like poison. A reporter leans toward her neighbor, voice sharp but hushed. "This will end his career." The words stab deeper than any testimony. The protagonist's fists clench under the table, nails pressing crescents into skin. His attorney leans in, whispering, "Stay calm, we'll fight this." But the words feel fragile, paper against fire. Across the aisle, the prosecutor paces with a predator's rhythm, certain of triumph. The defense attorney glares at the witness, eyes narrowing like blades. Every movement builds the sense of war inside a courtroom dressed as civility. The judge calls for recess, his gavel striking with less fury this time but no less finality. People rise from benches, voices buzzing, speculation spilling like wildfire. The protagonist does not move, rooted to the chair, his gaze lost in the distance. He remembers the roar of stadiums, the adoration of fans, the medals that once shone brighter than doubt. Now those memories feel like ghosts mocking him. His attorney touches his arm gently, but he does not react. Around him the world moves, but he remains frozen in the eye of a storm, only just beginning. The court reconvenes under a harsher light, as if the sun itself has become suspicious of every face. Judge Harold Whitaker said, "Proceed," and the word hangs like a blade. Damian Vale said, "Mr. Reyes, let's revisit your timeline," his smile thin as wire. Marco Reyes swallows, eyes darting to the jury, and his voice shakes like glass. "Patrick Sloan," said answer clearly, and the reprimand draws bloodless flinches from the gallery. Ethan Cole tastes copper in his mouth, a phantom of old injuries, and stares at the tabletop grain. Damian Vale said, "You testified you arrived at 9, yet the door log reads 8:43. The jurors shift in a ripple of doubt, pens scratching like tiny hammers. Marco Reyes said, "I misremembered. and the word sounds like a trap closing on itself. Damian Vale said, "And you had 2 drinks before that call, correct?" turning the comma into a sneer. Patrick Sloan said, "Objection argumentative, but the poison is already in the well." Ethan Cole remembers a stadium's roar and wonders how silence can be louder. Judge Harold Whitaker said, "Sustained," and the relief is thin as paper. The gallery breathes in the rhythm of a hive, all hum and sting, waiting for the next wound to open. Patrick Sloan said, "The witness made a human mistake, and the jury watches his hands more than his words." Ethan Cole said, "It was never me," under his breath, and the whisper feels heavier than steel. Damian Vale said, "Human mistakes become fatal when lives are on the line," and his cadence patrols the box. Linda Hart blinks hard, her notepad shivering as a letter slants into a blot. Judge Harold Whitaker said, "Counselor, mind the theatrics," yet the room has already swallowed the show. Marco Reyes said, "I only want the truth," and the sentence sounds like a plea to the ceiling. Patrick Sloan steps closer to the witness, careful as a surgeon near an artery. Ethan Cole remembers a podium, a medal, and the night the cameras turned cold. Damian Vale said, "Truth loves a clear clock," and he taps 9 digits on a screen. The numbers glow like an execution time, exact and merciless. The jurors write, and every scratch feels like a vote. A recess vanishes before anyone breathes, and testimony resumes like an old wound reopening on cue. Patrick Sloan said, "Mr. Reyes, did you know about the message sent that night?" And the syllables click. Marco Reyes said, "I saw it after," and shame lowers his gaze like a curtain. Damian Vale said, "Show the exhibit," and a blown-up text fills the screen with sterile cruelty. Ethan Cole reads his own words from years ago, angry and raw, torn from context like a tendon. He had typed them at 2 a.m., when grief was louder than reason, after a season-ending fall. Patrick Sloan said, "This is unrelated, but unrelated is a fantasy the jury cannot afford." Linda Hart stares at the pixelated timestamp, as if it confesses on its own. Damian Vale said, "It reveals character under pressure," and the phrase lands like a brand. Ethan Cole said, "I was in pain, and the room hears only the past, not the fracture." Judge Harold Whitaker said, "Jury will consider weight, not sympathy," and the balance shudders. The image lingers, a ghost with perfect recall, and the day grows colder. The next witness is sworn, and the oath tastes of metal as the court swallows it whole. "Damian Vale," said Detective Harlan, "your report notes a missing minute," and the hungry pause stretches. Detective Harlan said, "The camera glitched," and the word lands like a dent. Patrick Sloan said, "Chain of custody remains intact, but his voice threads through barbed wire." Damian Vale said, "Let the jury see Exhibit R," and a still frame appears, blurred at the edges like a lie. Ethan Cole feels the cold bloom in his ribs as a silhouette leans near his door. The timestamp is a thin noose looped in digits waiting for a throat. Patrick Sloan said, "This still is excluded under prior order," and the courtroom freezes. Judge Harold Whitaker said, "Counselor, approach," and the sidebar becomes a quiet storm. The gallery strains, rumor muscles flexing under polite clothing. Damian Vale returns with a satisfied stillness that drips contempt. Ethan Cole said, "That is not me," and the denial feels small against the screen. When the lights dim for the next clip, the room inhales like a single lung and forgets to exhale. The footage refuses to play, and the silence thrums with suspicion. Damian Vale said, "Technical issues are such a pity, layered with silk and ash." Patrick Sloan said, "We move on," but his eyes betray the fire licking at patience. Ethan Cole counts heartbeats like steps along a ledge he cannot see. Linda Hart presses a palm to her sternum, willing it still, and fixes on Ethan as if he might speak. Marco Reyes watches his own hands, unable to trust them with honesty. Judge Harold Whitaker said, "Counsel will confer after recess," and the gavel lands with weary gravity. Damian Vale said, The jury deserves clarity, while fogging the glass with every word. Ethan Cole said, I will not break, and the vow is quiet enough to feel true. The room exhales at last, and the day tilts toward a darker edge. Morning returns like an audit, bright and unforgiving, and the courtroom absorbs the light without warmth. Damien Vale said, let us be efficient, and the word sounds like a lock engaging. He paces with a surgeon's calm, eyes mapping the jury for fractures to widen. Patrick Sloan said, we object to this line, but the pulse of the room has already shifted. Ethan Cole keeps his spine straight and his breath quiet, counting 4 beats in and 4 beats out. Damien Vale said, Mr. Reyes, who texted you first, as if chronology could become a weapon. Marco Reyes said, he did, and the syllables stagger. Linda Hart records the exchange with pen strokes like tally marks for sins. Judge Harold Whitaker said, answer only what is asked, and the warning lands dull against steel. Damien Vale said, so the initiative was his, and he let silence play prosecutor. Ethan Cole said, that was about sponsorship travel, and the explanation die cuts itself on entry. Damien Vale said, the jury will decide context, and his smile ends the argument. Ethan watches hope wobble like a coin spinning toward a face he cannot control. The lunch break becomes a battlefield with microphones, and the marble steps gleam like teeth. A cluster of cameras waits, glassy and patient. Damien Vale said, we welcome transparency, and the press inhales the perfume of certainty. Patrick Sloan said, this is tried in court, not on the steps, but his caution feels like a whisper in wind. Linda Hart said, Mr. Vale, did the timestamp dispute end your doubts? And the question is bait glittering with hunger. Damien Vale said, we follow facts, and he tilts his chin like a verdict. Ethan Cole stands a pace behind his counsel, watching his name float in headlines that exist only in eyes. He remembers crowds chanting his victories, and hears the same rhythm turning against him. Patrick Sloan said, Ethan maintains his innocence, and he places a hand on Ethan's shoulder like ballast. A storm hint darkens the noon sky, and the air smells like wet copper. Ethan said, I will face the truth, and the sentence tastes like stone swallowed whole. The afternoon session opens with a name that tenses the room like a drawn bow. The clerk calls Riley Ward, and footsteps echo with the cadence of old debts. Riley Ward is the fixer who knows where every door hides its hinge. Patrick Sloan said, state your occupation, and the witness smirks with caution. Riley Ward said, consultant, and the euphemism hangs perfumed and poisonous. Damien Vale said, have you ever assisted Mr. Cole? And the word assisted curls into threat. Ethan Cole feels the floor cool through his soles, a reminder to stand even while seated. Riley Ward said, I advised his team on security and logistics, and truth skims just above denial. Patrick Sloan said, did you traffic in evidence? And the gallery leans. Riley Ward said, I traffic in discretion, and the room exhales in judgment. Linda Hart scribbles, the ink quick and dark. Judge Harold Whitaker said, answer directly, and the gavel's shadow stretches across polished wood. Ethan watches a life shrink to rumors, dressed as testimony. The juror with the secret sits in disciplined stillness, but her pen taps a morse of unease. Her name is Avery Knox, and secrets have sharp corners. Damien Vale said members of the jury will disregard speculation, yet he feeds them flavor with each measured word. Patrick Sloan notices the tap and files it with a hawk's patience. Ethan Cole said, they see me as the worst moment I ever had. And the thought scrapes. Linda Hart watches Avery Knox with the intuition of a scavenger for tremor. Damien Vale said, character is conduct over time, and he threads old headlines with new shadows. The judge warns again, but theater has found its stage. Avery Knox inhales and stops the tap, though her jaw flexes. Patrick Sloan said, we will start our case tomorrow, and the promise tries to anchor the tide. Ethan holds his breath and imagines silence as a bridge he can cross without falling. Dusk leaks through the windows, and drapes the room in a bruise of color. The judge declares adjournment, and chairs hush against the floor. Damien Vale said, "See you in the morning," and exits like a curtain falling. Patrick Sloan said, "We pivot at first light," and he gathers files with a practiced sweep. Ethan Cole said, "What if the pivot is too late, and the question tastes like old iron?" Linda Hart lingers near the aisle, hoping for a glance that becomes a quote. Marco Reyes stares at the empty witness chair as if it could apologize. Riley Ward avoids every eye as if the carpet offered immunity. Avery Knox walks out with her shoulders squared, keeping her secret from the night air. Judge Harold Whitaker leaves last, a silhouette etched in fading gold. Ethan stands alone at the rail and lets his hand rest there. He feels the wood's groove, worn by other storms, and decides to breathe again. Morning breaks brittle, and the courtroom smells like old paper and rain-soaked wool. Judge Harold Whitaker said, "Call your next witness," and the room straightens its spine. Patrick Sloan said, "The defense calls Riley Ward," and surprise hisses through the gallery. Riley Ward walks like a man stepping onto thin ice that pretends to be marble. Patrick Sloan said, "You worked for Ethan Cole's team," and the words hang like bait. Riley Ward said, "Consulted on logistics," and his smile is a locked drawer. Patrick Sloan said, "Who hired you first?" and a name glints beneath the surface. Riley Ward said, "A firm called Kite Harbor, LLC," and paper rustles like rain. Patrick Sloan said, "Records show Kite Harbor is controlled by Damien Vale's client," and the gallery inhales fire. Damien Vale said, "Objection, but the voltage has already arced." Ethan Cole feels the floor steady for the first time in weeks. Judge Harold Whitaker said, "Overruled," and the gavel sounds like a door unlatching. Patrick Sloan said, "Submit Exhibit AA," and the screen blooms with emails stamped midnight. The header reads like a confession written by a clock. Riley Ward said, "Those were coordination notes, but the words limp." Patrick Sloan said, "Read the subject line," and silence leans in. Riley Ward said, "Missing minute deliverable," and a juror flinches. Damien Vale said, "This is foundationless spin," but his voice carries grit. Ethan Cole said, "You sold me as a weapon, and the thought tastes like ash." Patrick Sloan said, "Payment routed from Kite Harbor toward security 3 days before the glitch," and the dates punch. Linda Hart scribbles so fast the ink threatens to smoke. Judge Harold Whitaker said, "The jury will consider intent," and the gallery hums. Riley Ward exhales like a tire losing air and stops meeting anyone's eyes. The second blade turns when the next file opens, and the gallery tilts toward it like iron to a magnet. Patrick Sloan said, "Exhibit AB," revealing a sealed affidavit with a familiar signature. Marco Reyes said, "I never signed that," and terror threads the syllables. Patrick Sloan said, "It is notarized by a contractor paid through Kite Harbor," and the math burns. Damien Vale said, "Counsel mischaracterizes the record, but the pitch climbs." Ethan Cole hears his name coughed up by the affidavit like a curse. Patrick Sloan said, "This affidavit created the motive you sold to the press," and glass breaks in silence. Linda Hart said, "For the record, who wrote the first draft," and the room pivots. Riley Ward said, "I did," and blinks as if each word costs blood. Judge Harold Whitaker said, "Members of the jury, you will weigh credibility," but doubt has already perched. Avery Knox stops tapping her pen and pins Vale with a cool, private stare. Patrick Sloan said, "One more exhibit," and the temperature drops. The screen fills with a voicemail transcript labeled "Private," obtained under subpoena, and the words bruise. A familiar voice purrs strategy like a lullaby for wolves. Damien Vale said, "Irrelevant," but his eyes flick to the exit as if it speaks. Patrick Sloan said, "Play the clip," and the court hears Riley Ward coach the phrasing of regret. Riley Ward said, "I fed both sides because that is how truth pays," and the line sinks like lead. Ethan Cole said, You were my safeguard inside his skull, and the betrayal cleaves. Judge Harold Whittaker said, the jury will disregard counsel's reactions. Yet reactions multiply in the air. Patrick Sloan said, the mastermind behind the lies was never my client, and the title lands like a verdict. Damien Vale smiles without warmth, a mask that sweats behind glass. The ground drops for the last time when the clerk delivers an envelope like a live wire. Patrick Sloan said, Your Honor, newly admitted under the court's order, and the seal breaks with a papery gasp. It is a will, revised the week before the incident, and it redraws money's map. The beneficiary is not Ethan Cole, but a charitable trust founded by his estranged mentor. Marco Reyes said, I thought Ethan would inherit, and his certainty crumbles. Patrick Sloan said, so motive dissolves, and he lets the jury listen to absence. Damien Vale said, convenience masquerading as virtue, yet his tone wobbles. Ethan Cole feels the chainsaw hum of rumor stall at last. Linda Hart whispers the headline forming behind her teeth, and writes it anyway. Judge Harold Whittaker said, we will recess to consider instructions, and the gavel lands like surf. Avery Knox exhales slowly, as if letting go of a secret no longer needed. Dawn hardens the courthouse into a fortress, and resolve settles like armor on tired shoulders. Patrick Sloan said, we open our case, and the promise cuts clean. He stacks exhibits like stepping stones across a river that once drowned them. Ethan Cole said, I will testify, and the vow steadies his breath. Judge Harold Whittaker said, proceed, and the room leans forward as one body. Patrick Sloan said, Detective Harlan's timeline omits the maintenance log, and paper answers with a thud. The log shows a technician inside the building at the missing minute. Damien Vale said, coincidence does not acquit, and he bares teeth behind a smile. Patrick Sloan said, it explains the camera glitch, and the words land with ballast. Linda Hart writes faster, hearing a headline grow legs. Marco Reyes said, I didn't know about the technician, and surprise stripes his face. Avery Knox stops her pen midair, and the stillness rings like a bell. Ethan Cole said, truth is boring until it saves you, and hope stretches, thin but unbroken. Patrick Sloan said, call Ethan Cole, and the gallery inhales like a tide returning. Ethan takes the stand as if stepping back into a ruined stadium. Ethan Cole said, I was at home at 8:43, and the sentence lands steady. Patrick Sloan said, explain the angry text, and the question softens the fuse. Ethan Cole said, it was pain speaking, not intent, and scar tissue shows in the voice. He details surgeries, sleepless hours, and the night he typed without wisdom. Damien Vale said, you lash out when cornered, and the jab hunts blood. Ethan Cole said, I learned to fall and get up, and the room hears the old captain rise. The jury follows his cadence like a metronome that never lies. Judge Harold Whittaker said, answer the question, and only the question, yet his gaze is measured and human. Linda Hart notes the shift, the first warmth after weeks of frost. Avery Knox nods once, almost invisible, but the gesture feels seismic. Patrick Sloan said, defense calls Dr. Mia Ellison, and a calm presence crosses the floor. She is not here to charm but to measure. Dr. Mia Ellison said, these access logs reflect a maintenance override, and the pointer rests on cold numbers. Patrick Sloan said, could that cause footage loss? And the math nods. Dr. Mia Ellison said a brief blackout consistent with the missing minute, and doubt cracks like old paint. Damien Vale said, your firm consulted for the arena once, reaching for smoke. Dr. Mia Ellison said, in compliance and years ago, and her tone is rain on embers. Ethan Cole watches the jury lean toward the method, not the myth. Linda Hart underlines override twice as if drawing a door. Judge Harold Whittaker said, the witness is credible, and the bench regains gravity. Avery Knox writes slowly, as though each letter risks breaking the spell of clarity. The room exhales, not in relief, but in recognition. Momentum turns audible, a hum beneath every shoe. Patrick Sloan said, "Recall Riley Ward," and the fixer walks as if gravity doubled. Patrick Sloan said, "Who drafted the affidavit's first version, and his tone is surgical." Riley Ward said, "I did at counsel's request," and the gallery tilts. Damian Vale said, "Which counsel?" and his voice seeks escape routes. Riley Ward said, "The firm aligned with the prosecution's outside strategy, and the phrase tastes like iron filings." Patrick Sloan said, "Name it," and silence burns. Riley Ward said, "Kite Harbor, LLC," and air leaves the room again. Ethan Cole said, "You sold a story that never happened," and the thought steadies the keel. Linda Hart hears a headline shed its scales and become a blade. Judge Harold Whitaker said, "Jury will disregard commentary, yet no one can." Avery Knox folds her hands and looks straight at Ethan, and belief is no longer shy. The counterattack seals with a final stitch. Patrick Sloan said, "Move to admit the revised will and maintenance proof as one narrative, and structure becomes story." Judge Harold Whitaker said, "Admitted," and the word is a keel under a storm. Damian Vale said, "The defense paints coincidence as destiny, but the paint runs." Patrick Sloan said, "Destiny needs no help when the facts align," and he lets the exhibits breathe. Ethan Cole said, "I did not do this," and it no longer sounds like a plea. Marco Reyes said, "I was wrong about the timing," and shame throws off its coat. Linda Hart writes the cleanest sentence of the trial and underlines it twice. Avery Knox stops writing altogether and simply watches Ethan. The gallery is quieter than prayer. Judge Harold Whitaker said, "We continue tomorrow with closings," and the gavel lands like a heartbeat returning to rhythm. Ethan Cole stands, taller by nothing you can measure and everything that matters. Morning sharpens every edge, and the courtroom holds its breath like a diver before black water. Judge Harold Whitaker said, "Proceed to closings," and the words turn the key. Patrick Sloan said, "This case is not theater," and his voice threads steadiness through the room. He lays facts like stones, careful, weighty, and impossible to wish away. Patrick Sloan said, "A maintenance override explains the gap, not malice," and the jury listens for seams. He points to the revised will, a map that roots motive elsewhere. Patrick Sloan said, "When the money leaves, so does the lie," and the gallery stills. Ethan Cole watches the jurors, seeing doubt soften into thought. Patrick Sloan said, "You decide on evidence, not echoes," and he lets silence make its argument. Linda Hart writes, catching a cadence that sounds like truth learning to stand. Avery Knox folds her hands, eyes clear and unsparing. Judge Harold Whitaker said, "Thank you, counsel," and the hush lands like snow without mercy. Damian Vale rises like a blade requesting work, and the room tilts toward the cut. Damian Vale said, "Stories hide inside facts," and he turns context into smoke. He walks the jury through timestamps as if leading a tour of doubt. Damian Vale said, "Character is conduct when no one is watching, and old headlines glimmer like traps." He calls Ethan's midnight text a flare fired at innocence. Damian Vale said, "Coincidence breeds alibis," and the line stalks the box. Ethan Cole lifts his chin but keeps still, tasting salt and steel. Linda Hart notes the precision, the polish, the charming venom. Damian Vale said, "If motive moved, intent remained," and he draws a circle that refuses to open. Patrick Sloan watches like a surgeon guarding an artery. Avery Knox blinks once, slow, as if weighing an anchor. Judge Harold Whitaker said, "Conclude, counselor," and the final bow is cut from ice. Rebuttal is a match struck in a wind tunnel, brief and essential. Patrick Sloan said, "The state offered plot. We offer proof," and he taps the access log. Patrick Sloan said, "Ward's emails planned the gap, and intent receives a name." He holds up the revised will, and motive evaporates like fog at noon. Patrick Sloan said, "When the lie loses food, it dies," and he rests. Ethan Cole said, "Thank you," without sound, and breath finds him again. Damien Vale watches with the stillness of a chess endgame. Linda Hart circles two words, override and will, until they look like doors. Avery Knox lets her pen rest, as if the page now knows enough. Judge Harold Whitaker said, "Jury will retire to deliberate," and the command tastes metallic. The bailiff opens a quiet path, and the jurors file out with their weather inside them. The room empties without relief, like a tide that forgot to return. Hours turn to wire stretched between hearts, humming with fear. Ethan Cole sits in an anteroom that smells of coffee and old varnish. Patrick Sloan said, "Whatever comes, you told the truth, and the reassurance holds like a handrail." Ethan Cole said, "I want my name to mean something again, and the plea is quiet iron." Linda Hart waits in the hallway, listening to elevator bells like omens. Marco Reyes said, "I was wrong, and the apology is a thin candle that refuses to die." Riley Ward stares at his reflection in a darkened window, and finds no shelter there. Damien Vale passes by without a glance, a storm that used up its rain. The world reduces to door hinges, footsteps, and breath. Ethan Cole said, "I will walk out standing," and resolves to mean it. Patrick Sloan closes his eyes for one long count. The bailiff appears and time snaps like a rope. The courtroom refills like a lung gasping awake, and every seat squeaks louder than thunder. Judge Harold Whitaker said, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" and the formality strains. Avery Knox stands, paper in hand, voice steady as a plumb line. Avery Knox said, "On the charge we find the defendant not guilty," and the room fractures into silence. Ethan Cole closes his eyes, as if light just returned after a storm. Damien Vale's smile does not reach his eyes, and the mask finally looks like one. Patrick Sloan said, "Thank you," and it lands like a benediction. Linda Hart writes a single word, "cleared," and lets the pen stop. Marco Reyes bows his head, a hinge set right. Riley Ward exhales a debt he can never repay. Judge Harold Whitaker said, "This court is adjourned," and the gavel becomes a heartbeat. Ethan Cole stands, not taller but truer, and the air tastes new. The hallway swells with footsteps and flash pops, and relief tastes strange, like metal rinsed clean. Patrick Sloan said, "Breathe." We move with care, and his voice steadies the air. Ethan Cole said, "Not guilty" still leaves echoes, and the truth lands softly. Linda Hart said, "One question, Ethan, what do you want now?" and the recorder's red eye waits. Ethan Cole said, "A life that is quiet and honest," and the words feel earned. Marco Reyes said, "I'll sign a correction," and the apology hangs with weight. Riley Ward keeps to the shadow of a pillar, as if light might audit him. Damien Vale walks past with the calm of a man, inventorying losses. Avery Knox said, "Do not waste this clean slate," and her tone is flint stripped of heat. Patrick Sloan said, "There will be civil storms," and he lifts a folder like a shield. Ethan Cole said, "I will meet them standing," and the promise stops shaking. Night folds around the city, and Ethan returns to an apartment that remembers him better than the world did. He sets his phone face down and waits for silence to settle. Patrick Sloan said, "I'll call at 9 about next steps," and leaves the door ajar for hope. Linda Hart texts for a final quote and deletes it before pressing send. Ethan Cole said, "No more statements," to the empty room, and it agrees. He opens a box of medals that once argued louder than character. Ethan Cole said, "You are not my spine," and the metal does not answer. A photo of a team huddle watches him forgive a younger self. The city hums with another trial that belongs to someone else. Ethan Cole said, "Tomorrow, I run without cameras," and breath deepens. Sleep arrives like a truce signed in pencil. Morning brings a thin gold edge, and the courthouse steps look smaller without verdicts inside them. Damien Vale waits near the railing, like a statue set a degree off balance. Ethan Cole said, "You fought to win, not to know," and the air does not move. Damien Vale said, The game is the same for all of us, and the line tries to sound clean. Patrick Sloan, said games, end where duty begins, and the words land heavier than law. Damian Vale said, you were spared by luck, and his eyes refused the mirror. Ethan Cole said, I was spared by facts you bent, and the step holds. Linda Hart said, do you regret the tactics and Gull answers first? Damian Vale said, regret is for memoirs, and he turns away like a closing argument that lost the jury. Ethan Cole said, do better, and the day warms by 1 degree. By noon, the prosecutor announces an internal review, and the city exhales a fraction. Riley Ward walks into a precinct with a lawyer who looks like sleep deprivation. Riley Ward said, I will make a statement, and the words feel heavier than cuffs. Patrick Sloan said, accountability is the last exhibit, and he files it under necessary. Linda Hart said, sources confirm a charging evaluation, and the newsroom hums like wire. Marco Reyes said, I'll testify to the pressure I felt, and the truth grows a backbone. Avery Knox emails the court, a note of gratitude to the clerks, quiet as rain. Ethan Cole said, let the system repair itself, and steps out of its way. The city chooses lunch over outrage, which is a kind of mercy. Judge Harold Whittaker signs orders, and the pen scratches like distant surf. The day steadies around consequences that finally found a map, but at sunset, Ethan returns to the empty courtroom and asks the bailiff for a minute with the wood that held him up. The benches smell of polish and breath that left hours ago. Ethan Cole said, thank you for not breaking, and rests his palm on the rail groove worn by strangers. He places one medal beneath the window where the light spills like honest testimony. Patrick Sloan said, keep it from the doorway, but Ethan shakes his head. Ethan Cole said, I'll earn another life instead, and the sentence hangs like smoke. Linda Hart watches, lowers her phone, and decides not to film. Avery Knox stands in the aisle, unseen, and smiles once. Judge Harold Whittaker steps in to retrieve a forgotten file and pauses, saying nothing. Ethan Cole said, I am leaving now, and does, with the door whispering closed behind him.